But again, I want to thank everybody for joining us for our program and for David Grant Noble joining us today. I'm going to stop my share so I can introduce David. David Grant Noble is a writer and photographer who lives in Santa Fe, New Mexico. He has long studied the Southwest's deep history and archaeology and traveled widely to photograph ruins, rock art, and landscape. And his pictures have been widely exhibited, published in magazines and books, and have won awards. Two notable books include Ancient Ruins and Rock Art of the Southwest, an archaeological guide, and In the Places of the Spirits. And I knew David from a past life as the COO of Western National Parks Association, where we honored him with one of those Emil Howry Awards. And his books sell widely across the national parks of the Southwest. And we're just delighted to have you here with us. Today, he's going to be discussing his new book, Saigon to Pleiku, a counterintelligence agent in Vietnam Central Highlands from 1962 to 1963. And my understanding is this book brings David back full circle to where he started his career with photography. And we're very excited to have you join us today. So thank you so much, David. We really appreciate having you.
Well, thank you very much, Scott. And I want to thank the Osher Institute of Learning for inviting me. And I understand there are a lot of people out there listening. I can't see you, but I think you can see me. It's kind of a curious situation for an old timer on the internet. But thank you all for coming. And as you've seen from the book cover, maybe I'll put that up now, shall I, Scott?
Go ahead and share your screen.
So as you see from the cover, I'm going to be talking about things that happened in 1962 and 63. So 60 years ago. And to refresh your memory about this long time ago period, this was after the French had been defeated in Vietnam. They had their colonial empire, including Southeast Asia. And after they were defeated in 1954 and left South Vietnam in 1956, and before the US sent combat troops to the country in 1965, there was this 9-year period. And I was in part of that, sometimes referred to as the advisor period, because it was the time in the Vietnam War when the American military who were there, who were not very many, were assigned to advise their Vietnamese counterparts in the war, the Civil War that they were fighting. So it's a relatively little known period in the Vietnam War. And even less well known is the intelligence part of it. And I was a covert intelligence agent there. And I've tried to look up stuff about that on the internet, and it's just not there at all. And I also, in preparing this book, I tried to get copies of my reports that, being 60 years old, have no secret value now. And I struck out even with the Public Information Act. Yeah, this is I'm going to give you a very narrow slice, very narrow indeed slice of what was happening in the Vietnam War during this unknown, little known period. If any of you have watched Ken Burns' documentary on the Vietnam War, 18 hours long, he devoted 3 or 4 minutes to this time period. So what I plan to do in the next 50 minutes or an hour is to talk a bit about my experiences and to read you a couple of extracts from the memoir and also from a letter that I wrote home. So let me start out by making a few comments about this book. There are three parts to it. One is memoir, and I wrote that some years after I returned in the late 60s or early mid 60s and late 60s and even later. And there are excerpts from letters that I wrote home while I was over there, usually within 24 or 48 hours of when things were happening. And I want to credit my mother for saving these letters. I'd even forgotten I'd written them, and before she died, I received a box in the mail with about 60 letters that I'd written to her and my father and to my brother and sisters. So, and then the third part of the book, the way it's put together, is photographs that I took while I was over there. And my mother was a photographer. She really was quite a good photographer, but she was focused on taking pictures of her family and her children especially. So she gave me her camera. It was an old German Zeiss Icon rangefinder that she had bought in the late 20s when my oldest sister was born. And I was the baby of the family. So when I was going off to Vietnam, she had no more use for the camera. She gave it to me. I have a lot of memories about that camera as a child because it didn't have a button that you pushed to take a picture. It had a kind of a long plunger. So I remember as a small kid going around the house with a camera. Of course, there was no film in it, and taking pictures and operating that plunger. And here I was so many years later with the camera, taking real photographs halfway around the world. So the book interweaves these three elements of memoir and excerpts from letters and photographs. And that was kind of a challenging thing to do. But in a sense, since some of the writing in the book happened 60 years ago in Vietnam and some 30, 40, 50 years ago, and the photographs originally made over there, and then I printed up the pictures for the book in recent years. It was 60 years in the making. Like a good stew, a long time simmering in the pot. At one level, this book tells my personal story as a supposedly covert intelligence agent operating in Saigon and then in the Central Highlands, and telling stories, anecdotes about my experiences and with the Army, and then on my own gathering intelligence. And so at another level, it's a story about a naive, uninformed 22-year-old having the experience of his life. I was fresh out of college. I knew little about Vietnam. In 1961, when I graduated, there were some newspaper stories about what was happening in Vietnam, but they were in the back pages of even the New York Times. And I was wrapped up in writing a thesis in college about Emile Zola. I had no time, really, very little time to read newspapers. And besides, the news focus in that era was Berlin, the Berlin crisis. And those of us who were in college knew that when our deferment ran out, it was Russia that was going to be the challenge, and especially going to Berlin. So Vietnam was just not something that I was aware of. Now, you might wonder how somebody gets into counterintelligence and sent overseas. You have to go through a background check, which is very, very detailed and takes investigators a long time to plow through all your character and the bills you haven't paid, and what you did in fraternities, and whether you had debts, and so on and so forth, whether you were what they then called homosexual, which would keep you out in a flash. And so I passed that. I went into the Army. I had to enlist in order to get into this specialty, and I was accepted into it and spent 12 weeks undergoing training at the intelligence headquarters of the Army in Maryland, a place called Fort Holabird. Fort Holabbird's still there, but it's no longer a military base. It has some other function. So at Fort Holabird, I was trained in everything from interviewing to the constitutional law, to surveillance, to map reading, to lock picking, and all the kinds of things that you read in spy novels that spooks do when they're out in the field. And some of what I learned during that training was useful when I got to Vietnam, but to be honest, not much. So I was assigned to Vietnam because I spoke French. I lived in Switzerland as a kid and learned French and was pretty fluent in it, majored in it in college. And so when I got a chance to choose an assignment, I put naturally France, thinking that Paris would be nice. And then I didn't know for my second choice what to put. I tried Belgium because I knew NATO was there, and maybe there was some military side to it, army side to it. And then for my third choice, I put any French-speaking country. And that's how I learned that French was spoken in Vietnam. Well, I didn't know where Vietnam was. I went to the Post Library and looked it up in the atlas. I couldn't find it. I couldn't find it in the index. The librarian told me, try Indochina. So I tried Indochina, and there it was, not as Vietnam, but Tonkin, Annam, and Cochin China, Lao, Cambodia, and Laos. So that gave me an initial clue, being at the Army's intelligence headquarters, about how up to date they were on Vietnam. They did not have an atlas that was remotely up to date. So shortly before leaving, I was handed my orders. Now, they were classified secret, and the outfit that I was to join was classified. My status was classified secret. I was issued a civilian diplomatic passport. I was relieved of my Army dog tags. Those are the little tags that hang around your neck that identify you as part of the Army. And I was told to leave my uniform at home. I was given a cover story to use while I traveled, and I set off. I didn't quite set off. The officer asked me if I had any questions. I said, yes, I have one. When I get to Saigon, what do I do? And he smiled and looked at me, and he said, don't worry, Noble, you will be met. I thought, oh my God, this is just like a spy novel. 008, I'm on my way. Well, as you may have guessed by now, I was not met. I arrived at the Tan Son Nhut Airport outside of Saigon, didn't even know where Saigon was. I had no name, no contact, no telephone number, nothing. And with a couple of other agents, we sat on a bench in the airport while everybody else on the Pan Am 1 flight disappeared and we were there alone, waiting. And after about 10 minutes, a couple of military police came up and asked us who we were and what we were doing there. And I said, we don't actually know. It's classified, but we're waiting for somebody. And he came back about 10 minutes later. He said, follow me. I very soon found myself in the police station. And I want to tell you with some embarrassment at the time, within half an hour of arriving in Saigon, this secret agent broke his cover and had to admit what he was and his status, and he didn't know what to do. Well, that was all straightened out. And I was taken to a villa, kind of in the suburbs of Saigon, a private villa that had been owned by a French family. And I found that this was where my outfit was living and working. And there were 8 counterintelligence agents in the country at the time. And they had only just arrived a couple of months before. So I and the agents with me brought it up to 12. The real name of our unit was the 704th Intelligence Corps Detachment, but we had the amorphous cover name of Central Registry. At my brief orientation, my commander, Mr. Gallagher, he was a major. We all called ourselves Mr. because, you know, we were undercover as civilians. We didn't ostensibly have any connection with the Army, but underneath it all, we had military rank. I asked him what I should say if somebody asked me what I did at Central Registry. Well, he looked at me, kind of rolled his eyes and said, tell them you register Centrals. And if they ask any more questions, leave the room. So you see, this was not what we think of as deep cover. I also asked him another question. I had a way of asking straightforward, naive questions that in some cases got straight to the point. I said, Mr. Gallagher, who exactly are the Viet Cong? And again, he rolled his eyes and he said, Noble, the Viet Cong is the bad guy. And you can know him because he looks just like a Vietnamese. Well, there was a slight problem when I arrived, and that was that they didn't have room for me. The villa was full, and they told me that I and another agent would have to live in a hotel downtown. So we were driven downtown and taken to a hotel that I saw was right on the Central Plaza. Now it was called then the Continental Palace. And it was the #1 hotel in Saigon and in Vietnam, I think, during the French colonial period. It was a beautiful building. Now, here's a picture of it. It's down it's on the right side of the picture. You can see there's a cafe at street level that opens up on the plaza. And to the right of the picture is the General Assembly building, which is the headquarters of the South Vietnam government. In the background, you see the cathedral. And that street running north, up and down is Tudo Street, as it became quite a notorious street later on during the American War. It was called Rue Catinat during the French colonial period, and now it has another name. Then I'll say a few things probably about that street as we go along. So I lived in that hotel, and I had a suite of 3 rooms on the 3rd floor. And if you see on the right side of the picture, there's a corner of a tree, and the balcony of my room was right behind that tree, overlooking the plaza. I really couldn't believe my luck. And when I was in the hotel, I was distinguished in the eyes of the hotel staff and Vietnamese person with a diplomatic passport, a civilian. When I went out to the villa where the 704th was headquartered, I was kind of a army flunky learning the ropes. So I went from one life as a soldier, really, to another as a civilian. Now I'm going to show you a few slides of Saigon. This is the cafe on the in the Continental Palace Hotel. This hotel was quite well known, and this cafe was notorious as a place, a locale where intrigues were planned. There were people from all over the world who were staying there. You could hear many languages. And it was where Graham Greene stayed when he wrote The Quiet American. And it figures into his book, and it figures into a number of movies about Saigon and the war. This is the Saigon River with a little freight boat and also a taxi going across to the other side of the river. And here's a close-up photo of one of the taxis. Everybody rode bicycles or took, little velos or cyclos, they called them. It was a two-seat little machine that was bicycled by a taxi driver. And here's a street in Saigon. Now, if you look at pictures on the internet of Saigon streets, they do not look like that. This was 1962, and the traffic was a lot less. And there were very few private cars. There were motorcycles, but nothing like you see there now. And some of you have probably been to Saigon, and you can verify what I just told you. The hotel itself that I stayed in, the Continental Palace, is now called the Continental Hotel. It's still there. It's much modernized. And I think it's rated now as kind of the third best hotel in Saigon. At the time I was there, it didn't have hot water. Well, in the tropics, you didn't need hot water. It had a creaky old elevator that would take you up and down. It didn't have air conditioning. Now that we could have used, but I think it does. I'm sure it does now. So I want to tell you a little bit about two men that had a big influence on my life in Saigon. And one, as you might have already guessed, was Mr. Gallagher, who was my commander. And I'll talk about him a bit more in a minute. And soon after I arrived, under strange circumstances that I won't relate now, they're a little bit embarrassing, but they're in the book. I met a senior officer in the Indian Army who was with the International Control Commission. And he too lived in the Continental Palace right down the hall from me. The International Control Commission supervised the Geneva Accords. So to back up a little bit, after the French lost the war in the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, there was a peace agreement between the North Vietnamese, South Vietnamese, and the French that was worked out in Geneva. And that peace agreement is known as the Geneva Accords. You can look it up and read it, I'm sure, on the internet. But it divided North and South Vietnam. And it also regulated, theoretically, what the militaries of both North Vietnam and South Vietnam could and could not do. So it was a peace agreement. The country was supposed to be at peace. North Vietnam was supposed to carry on under Ho Chi Minh. South Vietnam under President Ngo Dinh Diem and have elections. And everything was supposed to, go along smoothly. And we've seen this division of countries after a war, after other wars, Korea being one example. So this fellow that I met in the book, I refer to him as Kumar or Major Kumar. He was a major in the Indian Army and then promoted to Lieutenant Colonel. And he was part of the International Control Commission. And he was part of a team consisting of himself from India, a neutralist country, a Canadian from a capitalist or free country, and a Polish representative from a country in the Soviet Union. And they would go to bases, military bases in South Vietnam and North Vietnam and inspect them and to see if they were following the rules of the Geneva Accord. So here I was, just a few days in Saigon, and I was meeting, I had met someone who was going to North Vietnam. Not only going to North Vietnam, but he was going to military posts and Air Force posts up north. And this was kind of amazing to me. So he and I became good friends. And he was single and I was single, and we were living in the hotel, and we would meet and we would have tea in the cafe. We'd go out for lunch. We'd go out for dinner. We'd take long walks around the city, enjoying the amazing experience of being in Saigon. And, ironically, having wanted to go to Paris originally, I found myself in what was called the Paris of the Far East. Well, it wasn't like the real Paris, but it did have that flavor of a French city with wide boulevards lined with trees and so forth. So I'm going to read you a passage now from my memoir about my experience and my meeting with this fellow Kumar. Hold on just a second while I get my reading glasses. Here they are. His complexion was much lighter than that of the fabric salesman along Tudo Street. Now, there were many, many Indians in Saigon, and most of them had small shops, and most of the shops sold fabrics. Although his face was quite pockmarked, he was handsome. He had thick, neatly combed black hair and was smartly dressed, even when not in uniform. Clearly well educated, he spoke with the clipped intonations of a British schooled Indian. He was shorter than I was by several inches, but he carried himself with a military bearing that gave him greater stature. With me, he was always courteous and sensitive, and I sensed a genuine warmth beneath his reserved veneer. During the months of our association, Kumar never imposed himself or assumed I would be free to join him for a meal or a walk. Quote, "Would you care to join me for dinner this evening?" he might say. Even as our friendship between us grew, the formality continued. We often engaged in lengthy talks, but rarely did they lead to personal history or intimate topics. Early in our relationship, he asked me what I did. The question was hardly unexpected. I rolled my eyes and replied that I was employed by the Army and had a tedious clerical job. though I felt fortunate to be assigned to Saigon and living in this hotel. He seemed to accept the explanation. Still, I always wondered what he really thought about my status. Now, Kumar helped open my eyes, and I became aware of my political ignorance and naivete and Cold War biases. And I started to view international affairs through his eyes, the eyes of an informed neutralist. He helped me to grow up, question things, and think in broader terms. I was no longer indulging in college campus bull sessions. I was in Saigon now, learning from someone experienced in the world, a senior officer, almost a mentor. Without preaching, Kumar gently revealed his views about the world and about not a world ideologically divided, but in two, but more subtle and about people. I began to see Vietnam as a land of peasant farmers caught in a political drama beyond their control. He described the citizens of Hanoi not as communists, but as ordinary folk, people who in the early mornings gathered in the public square in front of his hotel and did exercises in time to music. Also, they revered Ho Chi Minh. These were uncomfortable thoughts that challenged Major Gallagher's caution that whatever we thought, we were not to question our country's involvement in Vietnam. As he had told us, America was committed and we had a job to do. End of story. It seemed clear enough directive then, but I began to realize it was not so simple. I was dealing with a house of cards. Pull one or two out and the whole structure might collapse. Meeting Kumar was but a first step, for beliefs are not easily abandoned, especially by a young soldier on active duty who was still disinclined to question authority. Still, I was beginning to question. At one meeting, Kumar told me about a recent Soviet buildup on a North Vietnamese air base that he had seen. The following morning, I wrote a report about this. I wondered if it would catch anyone's attention at headquarters. Well, it did. For a few minutes later, I was summoned to the commander's office. He was looking at the report and shaking his head. He motioned me to sit down. First, he went into his now familiar tirade about the incompetence of the agents the Army was sending him. Immediately, I regretted having written the report. When his outburst had run its course, he pushed the paper away and turned his small, penetrating eyes my way. Yale, he said with irony, French literature. I sat still. He threw his eyes at the ceiling, stood up, and began pacing the floor. So now I've got a goddamn Ivy League French literature kid, fresh out of Fort Holabird, handling the potentially most important informant in Southeast Asia. He was shouting now and threw his arms in the air. The adjoining offices had fallen silent. He looked at me and gave a helpless shrug. Then he told me to close the door. Gallagher was about 50, paunchy, short neck, round shouldered, with crew cut, steely gray hair and ill-fitting clothes. He looked decidedly unmilitary. His shabby appearance and unpolished manner gave no hint of his being a career soldier. A true contrast to Kumar, who was of the same rank. In a civilian context, Gallagher might have been a shopkeeper or a boxing coach in some nitty-gritty inner city gym. If Kumar was the image of an officer, Gallagher was the stereotypical spy, or counterspy, as was the case. In counterpoint to his amorphous physical bearing, Gallagher brimmed with energy and intensity, and when he walked into a room, he commanded attention. He had a sharp, authoritative voice, alert, shifty eyes, and a temper and unpredictability that kept you off guard. He could be sullen, grouchy, and quiet or emotional, even passionate and verbal. Not infrequently, he would exit his office, stomp by our desks to the patio, and vent his frustrations on the pet monkey in the tree. Chico, he would yell, you're responsible for this goddamn mess. He had an acerbic wit and a sharp tongue, and he was always impatient. Gallagher returned to his desk, and after perusing my report once more, he put it down. He spoke now in a softer tone and said that for a novice like me to chance into a relationship with someone in Kumar's position was, and he almost smiled for a moment, unusual. Then he queried me in detail about Kumar. I answered cautiously, sensing a political predator testing the waters. Could he be considering some type of coercion? Kumar was single, lonely, stressed, and frustrated in his job. He never talked about women and had befriended a man half his age. I kept speculation to myself, for I knew that Kumar, even if potentially vulnerable, was a man of honor and dignity. Gallagher must know that any intelligence collecting adventure involving a greenhorn such as myself and a senior ICC official from a neutralist ally country would carry risks that could have, let us say, unfavorable political repercussions. In the end, he instructed me to continue playing it as I had been, to keep seeing Kumar, continue showing interest in his trips to North Vietnam, but only casual curiosity. I should gently encourage him to talk, but not raise suspicion by plying him with questions. He was to remain an unwitting informant. Gallagher asked what Kumar knew about me. I told him I was in Central Registry, and he asked me what I did there. Gallagher wanted to know what I'd replied. I told him, sir, just what you said, that we register centrals. He glared at me, sensing insubordination. I smiled, gaining a touch of confidence now. Actually, sir, I went on, I told him I maintain personnel records for the Army. The commander nodded approval. As the meeting progressed, I could tell that Halligan was now seeing me in a new light and allowing the barrier of rank to drop an inch or two. Briefly, he spoke to me as if I was actually a thinking person with a measure of intelligence. I asked what he wanted to know, and he produced a rapid-fire bucket list of desired information about North Vietnamese air bases, types of Soviet aircraft present, identification numbers, how many Russian military personnel, unit insignia, and so forth. Clearly, the Russians interested him more than Ho Chi Minh's popularity. Suddenly, he seemed to become aware of the developing tone of our discussion. He rose, told me to carry on, and I exited the room. I'm pausing a minute to catch up with my notes. So I'm going to take a little sip of water. Let me say a few comments about Central Registry. As I mentioned, there were 12 of us. who were agents in the country then. And not one of us, not one of the 12 of us spoke Vietnamese. Only one had ever been in Vietnam before, and only 2 of us spoke French. It became clear to me that no one seemed to know much about Vietnam, its history or its society, its culture, its people. To me, the competency level of the 704th Intelligence Corps detachment seemed amazingly low. When my mother sent me an informative New Yorker article about Vietnam that she had just read, she sent me a copy of it, and I passed it around to people in the office, and eventually it made its way to the commander. And he ordered somebody in the unit to make mimeograph copies, and it became required reading for every new incoming intelligence agent in Saigon. I told my mother about this later, and she said, "Oh, well, David, I'm very pleased to have made a small contribution to the war effort." There was a comic side to all of this. One day, for example, I found myself a 6'2" blonde American following a Vietnamese national who was leading me into the back streets of Cholan, which is Saigon's Chinese sister city. And well, what happened during that surveillance, I'll leave for you to read in the book. It's a bit, it's too many stories to tell right now. But what the point I want to make is that there was an absurdity, a ridiculous element to me and to all of us attempting to operate as secret agents in this Southeast Asian country. Now, during my 3 months in Saigon, I was given a variety of assignments. Some of them were very low level, but they seemed to build up to assignments with more responsibility. And in the book has a series of chapters about all of this. But during this period, apparently I was being evaluated. And in September, I learned that I had passed muster. And I was called into the commander's office with another agent who had recently arrived. And we were ordered to open an intelligence gathering operation up north in a small village called Pleiku in the then province of Pleiku. And this was in the central Highlands, a couple of 100 miles north of Saigon. And it was the country of indigenous tribes known collectively as Montagnards. So we were given instructions, we were given an orientation, and most of the orientation had to do with logistics. And at the end of it, I asked another one of my naive questions. I said, "Sir, when we get to Pleiku, what am I supposed to do?" And he said, "Noble, I want you to collect any information that you think might be helpful to General Harkin's efforts in Southeast Asia." And General Harkin was the commander of the whole military operation, which included Thailand. So we arrived in Pleiku. My partner did not speak any known language in that area, and he also did not have much of an affinity for Asian people, and that's kind of an understatement. So in effect, I was set off on my own to operate independently. And that's what I did. And I found that if my cover story in Saigon was ineffective, up there in the tribal country, it was kind of ridiculous. Many people, most people knew what I was up to. And most significantly, I'm sure the Viet Cong knew who I was. But I didn't really care. I was so happy to get out of Saigon, to get out from under the thumb of this rather oppressive commanding officer and away from doing a lot of jobs that I found were not very challenging, so we say. And here I was with an open-ended mission in a part of the country that no American Army intelligence person had ever been in before, and on my own to collect information that might be useful. So that's what I did. There was danger, of course, but I was 22 and the danger wasn't really visible. The Ho Chi Minh Trail was only about 20 kilometers away. There were Viet Cong everywhere, but they were not apparent, and they were mostly moving south to wage their civil war against South Vietnam in the Delta south of Saigon. So anyway, my attitude was, again, naive and uninformed, but I tended to take chances that now as an 80-something-year-old, I think we're probably kind of crazy. So I submitted reports to Saigon. I sent them down two or three times a week about everything I was learning about the people and the tribes, the politics, the battles, the cultures, the customs, the Viet Cong activities. And I got the impression that all of this was news to Saigon, or at least to my headquarters in Saigon. And so they sent me nothing but encouragement. And my sources were the local police. They were the Sûreté, a very important informant. The Sûreté was kind of the provincial police force, right? Like our sheriff's department, but for a province, not a county. Vietnamese intelligence officers, special forces that I met, Viet Cong captives that I interrogated, and missionaries, and also French planters. There were remnants of French in Vietnam, and quite a few had actually stayed on and married French women and become, in that sense, landowners through their wives, and were managers of rubber and coffee and tea plantations. So I want to say a word now about the Montagnards. But first I'll show you some photographs of Pleiku. This is a picture of the village of Pleiku, right downtown, as it were. And this is the village well, or one of the village wells. And the women are drawing water from a pump there into these big metal buckets, carrying them back to their homes over their shoulders. Women did a lot of strenuously hard work. Here's another street scene. He's selling dried fish. And here's another street scene. This is interesting because you see in the foreground, there are a couple of women selling fruit, bananas, and other fruits and produce. And behind them are half a dozen Vietnamese soldiers in the Army of Vietnam, Army of South Vietnam. And then to the left of the tree, right above the woman with the conical hat, there's a Montagnard. He's probably a Jerai or a Banar Montagnard with a burden basket on his back. And he had walked in from a village out in the countryside. And in the distance, you see the main mode of traffic, which is the bicycle. This fellow, gosh, there's a kind of a banner across his face. This is Major Bond, or Captain Bond, and he was the head of the Sûreté. He's out of uniform in this picture. He was my very important informant of mine, and we also became good, close, personal friends and spent a lot of time together. When I had a meeting with him to go over business, as it were, we'd always start out with a cup of tea and catch up on personal matters. And he and his wife had these 4 adorable children. Here I am. Well, I took the picture, so I'm not in the picture. But this is Marco Einaudi, who's in the photograph. He was another spy. He was assigned to Pleiku and to another part of the Highlands. And he had this wonderful vehicle that we would, on weekends, we'd collect the Montagnard kids and drive them around, which they just loved. It was the biggest thrill of their life to do this. This is another important informant of mine. His name was Charlie Long and his wife, BJ Long, and they were missionaries with the Christian and Missionary Alliance. They were evangelists. And Charlie would go out to villages, Montagnard villages that were remote and that I couldn't get to. And he had taught himself the Jerai language. So he was going to the Jerai villages. There were 2 Montagnard tribes in the area around Pleiku, the Jerai and the Banar. And to the south, there was another very important tribe called the Jerai. So anyway, I'd meet with him regularly, and I also attended some of his services. And here are some Vietnamese, construction workers on their lunch hour. And they were outside the house where I was living. And they were sitting there nitpicking. And this is how I learned the true sense of the term nitpicking. And when I took their picture, they were very amused to be photographed doing this. So now I'm going to start talking about the Montagnards. And as I said before, they inhabit the Central Highlands. They're tribal people. They've been in what's called Vietnam much longer than the Vietnamese. They go way, way, way back into prehistory. They are of Malayo-Polynesian ethnic origin, and they occupy 2/3 of Vietnam. So think about that. 2/3 of the country is occupied by and controlled by these people, not by the Vietnamese. The Vietnamese tended to live along the coast. And so naturally the battles that you have read about or may remember if you were in Vietnam that took place during the American War in Vietnam mostly happened along the coast until later on in the war, and they moved up into the highlands. So controlling so much of the country, the Montagnards were very important. And whether you were South Vietnamese, North Vietnamese, Viet Cong, or American, you wanted to have the Montagnards on your side. In those days, to gain their support, was believed to be the way to win the war. The unfortunate for them was that they were caught in the middle of a conflict that they did not fully comprehend. It was very difficult and stressful for them. And it was also a very tragic situation for them to be in. So while I was there, I tended to acquire a lot of sympathy for their plight. Well, I'm going to tell you something now about an experience I had, which is kind of the counterpart to what I told you about experiences in Saigon. And the Montagnards were fierce and skilled warriors. Their main weapons were spears and crossbows. And there was a village or a hamlet that was about 15 or 20 kilometers south of Pleiku that was known as Pleiku, and it was lived in by Jurai people. And this was in a very remote area. If you know Vietnam geography, between Pleiku and Kon, way off in the woods, in an area that the Viet Cong were free to roam in. And one of the ways the main way in the 1960s, early 60s, that was considered best to win the war was to create what the Americans and Vietnamese called strategic hamlets. Now, these were defensive villages, and the Vietnamese, and especially the Montagnards, were congregated into villages that were then defended architecturally and in other ways, so they could defend themselves from the Viet Cong. And this strategic hamlet program was just beginning at this village at Pleiku. And American Special Forces team was stationed there, along with a Vietnamese Special Forces team. And they were training the young men in this hamlet to fight. Well, when I was out there, I asked the commander, Captain Grace of the Special Forces there, how it was going training the Montagnards to fight. And he laughed at me and he said, training them to fight, they know how to fight better than we do. All we're doing is showing them how to use rifles. They know this country, they know where the Viet Cong are, and they are our guides, and they fight along with us. So this village of Pleiku in late December of 1962 was being set up with a Special Forces camp. And a few days before Christmas, it was being dedicated. And I went out with another fellow who was a captain. He was an intelligence officer who was advisor of a Vietnamese intelligence officer. So he was a real soldier, not like me. And I want to read to you a bit from my memoir about going out to that village, and then also from a letter I wrote home. I drove out to Pleiku on a Saturday morning just before Christmas with Captain Richard Edwards, an American intelligence advisor. We arrived about the same time as a host of military and civil officials, embassy and CIA tribespeople, foreign correspondents. Neil Sheehan actually was one of them, and hundreds of Jurai and Banar tribespeople who were streaming in from the villages in the surrounding countryside. It was clear that this particular strategic hammock dedication had been planned as a major public relations affair. And Camp Pleiku was to be a regional showpiece in the strategic hamlet program. 2 water buffaloes had been readied for the throngs of Montagnards who were arriving from their villages, and an elaborate meal was prepared for the Vietnamese and American guests. Before speeches by dignitaries started, I walked around the village to see how it looked and do some photography using my mother's old Zeiss icon and my newly acquired Bell & Howell 8mm camera, movie camera. No one expressed an objection to being photographed. And although 4 elders whom I photographed whom I asked their permission to take their photograph, showed no interest in what I was doing. So I'll read on in a minute, but first I'll show you some more pictures of the Montagnards, so you'll get a sense of who these people were. This was another village called Bon Me Tuit. A woman with her baskets. Here are some women walking to town with their wares to sell in Pleiku along the road. Portrait of a man. This fellow was in another hamlet that I used to drive out to on weekends. And I took my camera, I took pictures of the people, I took their portraits. I had them developed in town by a Vietnamese photographer who had a wedding photo studio, and he'd make up snapshots, and then I'd bring them back to the village and hand them out to the people. And it was, for all of them, the first time they had photographs of themselves. And first time I think they had seen photographs. This guy used to follow me around everywhere, very friendly. Another woman in the village. You see, she has a whiskey bottle in her basket. That was not full of whiskey. It was a bottle that she had scrounged to carry water in. Mostly they carried water in gourds. Another scene out in the village. I became pretty good friends with the people out in this hamlet. There was one tribesman out there who spoke French, and he interpreted for me when needed to. Mostly we just communicated with body language. Sometimes I even joined their dances. There's another fellow with his children and some other kids from the village. Another guy I met along the road. I brought home a pipe looking just like that. The men smoke pipes, and the women often smoke cigars. And here are some of the kids in that village that I went to. Now, I should interject that I was very struck by their poverty. And the people in this village had been transferred from another part of the country. So they had nothing. In the background, you see a perimeter fence. That's part of the strategic hamlet program of building defensive village ramparts around the village. So I recruited my mother to collect old clothing from our hometown. And she took that assignment to heart and sent me boxes and boxes of old clothes. And I brought them out to the villages, and I gave most of the boxes to the missionaries to take out. And here they are wearing, a lot of them wearing the clothes that my mother collected from our neighbors. And here's another picture I love. A couple of girls. Now, at the time, I thought I was probably giving them useful clothes, but I think in reality, for them, it was just a costume party, because they had their own ethnic traditions in the clothes they wore. And I'd be very surprised if they didn't if they wore these clothes much other than to have a good time and once in a while. Okay, so now I'm getting back to Pleiku and my experience out there. So reading on in my memoir, I had been in the Highlands for more than 3 months, and already my attitude toward the Montagnards had evolved. This is along with my attitude towards the war. Whereas I first viewed them as backward, primitive, and impoverished, in a sense, inferior to us. Now I saw them, and I think my photographs reflect this, as handsome, dignified people with their own distinct cultural traditions and strong family ties. The men were generally of short stature, trim and muscular. They wore loincloths and shirts of hand-woven black striped fabric, and they smoked long-stemmed pipes. Their houses were beautifully designed from local materials, timbers, sticks, and grass, and were built up on poles. I was particularly struck by a tall, elegant house with a steeply pitched roof. There was the residence, I was told, of unmarried men. The family houses often had a porch or balcony where women would weave cloth on a loom, and beneath the floors, firewood could be stacked. Cows, pigs, goats, and chickens could take shelter. You can see that in this picture. I also passed some barracks where the Jurai trainees lived, and I entered one of the barracks where I was able, even in the dim light, to photograph some young soldiers hanging out and cleaning their rifles. A ceremony, including the ritual slaughter of a water buffalo, was held in the village center. After that, the Vietnamese and American guests banqueted under an awning, while some of the Jurai men feasted separately a short distance off. They dragged the sacrificed buffalo away, hacked chunks of meat off the carcass, and roasted it over an open fire on their bayonets. The Montagnards had also brought with them an abundance of tall ceramic amphorae filled with rice wine. The jars were over 2 feet in height, with a neck about 3 inches high. Missionaries condemned the native custom of consuming large amount of rice wine as both immoral and wasteful of rice and time, and preached against it. However, getting drunk after a harvest was a deeply entrenched cultural tradition among the Montagnards. Following their buffalo feast, the Jurai headmen invited some of us to join them in drinking from their huge jugs of rice wine. I felt it would be rude to refuse, and besides, I was curious. I sat in a chair by an amphora alongside the main chief or shaman, and sucked the brew up through a long bamboo straw that went all the way down to the murky bottom of the jar. I confessed to some apprehension about doing this, not so much for the foul taste and questionable ingredients, than for fear of being exposed to TB or leprosy from the bamboo tube, which had already been used by previous imbibers. So now I'll show you a few more photographs. Here's that wonderful house I mentioned, which was lived in by unmarried men. It was kind of bachelor's quarters. So another advantage to putting the house up on stilts was that during the rainy season, when it rained every day like crazy, it would keep snakes and other creatures out of their house. And here are the 4 men I mentioned. They were elders in the village. I love that photograph of them. Here's one of the Pleiku villagers smoking his pipe. You can see the machete on the ground. Now, this picture shows the defense that had been built around Pleiku. So you can see on the far right, there's a fence, doesn't show too well. And then there's a moat that's filled with bungee stakes or sharpened bamboo spikes, and another fence, and then a third fence. So the Viet Cong would come into these villages at night to get food and to harangue the villagers against the South Vietnamese and Americans and democracy, and try to intimidate them to join the Viet Cong, in which, as we know now, they were successful. And here's the picture of the barracks with these young Montagnard recruits. They're cleaning their rifles, or what a couple of them are. And this village, a few days after I left, after I was there, was attacked by 2 battalions of Viet Cong and pretty much wiped out. And 35 of these young tribal soldiers were slaughtered. And the Viet Cong had lured the American and Vietnamese special forces away from the camp with a decoy, and then they had attacked the camp at night. It was a terribly sad situation. It was a true massacre. Here are the boys and men with their amphorae. You can see how beautifully made they are. You see the straw sticking out. It goes all the way down to the bottom. And this, have a quick look at the clothing they're wearing. They have loincloths on, and then they have shawls or shirts that mostly were made by their wives in the villages. And here we have a picture of, this is the captain I referred to. His name was Captain Grace. And Vietnamese Special Forces officer with this bamboo straw over the rice wine jug. And then notice the Vietnamese headman on the left, because I'm going to show you a picture of him a little bit later. He was the chief. And here is a picture of the ceremony that was going on at the time. And you see the Montagnard men in their typical clothing, beating gongs and dancing. It's kind of a line dance. It reminds me, I live in New Mexico, by the way, and in Pueblo country. And the Pueblo Indians do line dances that, without the gongs, it's kind of similar to this, but they beat a drum instead. So I'll read a little more from the letter I wrote home. This is a letter to my parents, dated December 24th, 1962. Quote, I must set aside a part of this letter and try and describe Jarai rice wine. It is made with spring water and rice, and is drunk in great quantity. Great quantity. The amount of it which a man can consume is relative to his power and strength as a man. So drinking rice wine with a Jarai is not only a challenge, but also a contest, and a very drunk one indeed. The jug is about 2 feet high and has a neck which is about 7 inches in diameter. A piece of split bamboo is laid over the top, and in the split is set a sliver of bamboo pointing down into the jug. This sliver is about 1.5 inches long. The idea is to drink down the wine non-stop until the bottom of the bamboo sliver is entirely out of the wine. Thus, the sliver acts as a measuring stick. And if you do not understand the above explanation, the end result is that to drink to the bottom of the bamboo sliver once is equal to consuming about 1.5 glasses of wine. I might add that the wine is more than wine. It is grass, weeds, seeds, herbs, rice, and assortment of other materials whose identity I am glad I do not know. One of these, I was told by a Vietnamese, is the raw blood of the sacrificial animal. This I quite believe, as I think I tasted a rich, heavy substance in the wine, along with all the rest. By the time I had finished, I had polished off 6 measures. The dry love to get Americans drunk. In fact, the dry equivalent of hello is let's get drunk. Well, we did. On my second jug, a chief came up to me, squatted at my feet while I drank, and poured fresh blood from the sacrificed buffalo on my right foot, smeared it around, and mumbled a prayer to the spirits. I found out later that this is an honor, and the prayer is meant to protect you from evil spirits, including the Viet Cong, which are to me a bit more real than the spirits. I was informed that I'd been initiated into the tribe. On the 5th jug, I saw a formidable looking Jirai who was identified to me as the chief of all the Jirai villages. He was a strong figure of a man, armed with a long machete that hung in his scabbard from his belt, which he had used an hour earlier to kill a water buffalo. So my mind always on the duty, I went over and introduced myself. He grunted and offered me his bamboo straw and a measuring stick. His wine was considerably stronger than the rest. I got down several slugs when all the slugs from the previous 5 jugs began ascending rapidly into my throat. So I stopped in order to get my bearings, and the chief came out with a rather severe sounding monologue, which was translated to me in French by the Vietnamese who spoke Jirai, to the effect that, quote, the chief, he chew your ass because you stopped drinking wine. So I slugged it all down, and afterwards was presented with a tribal bracelet, which is considered an honor to receive. And I was very honored, especially since it was presented to me by the chief of the village and the chief of the whole Jirai tribe. I shall always keep it. So a few more pictures. Here is that fellow in the process of slaughtering the buffalo. 2 of them, in fact, 2 of the, well, we call them witch doctors, but they were tribal chieftains. There are some village Jirai girls in the background watching, and some soldiers. And here are the tribal people eating the slaughtered buffalo over their campfire. Now, I'm going to show you a few pictures of the tribal people. These are girls of the Jirai tribe marching in a parade in Pleiku during Independence Day. Independence Day in Vietnam commemorates a defeat of the Chinese by 2 warrior women, and they're known as the Truong sisters, and they are the Joan of Arcs of Vietnam. Very important in their history. And here's a platoon of Montagnard spearmen marching in the Independence Day parade, and a company of crossbowmen. I brought one of these crossbows home, and they're thrown, the girl is, a Vietnamese girl in her ao dai is throwing confetti on them. And this is a platoon of Montagnard rifle women. So you can see that the warriors, the Montagnard warriors, included both men and women. The man in the white uniform in the background is the commanding general of two corps, which is a major part of military part of Vietnam. His name is General Ton Tat Dien, and he later was a leader in the overthrow of the president and helped to take over Vietnam. And that's a picture of me in at a French plantation in a tea field. And the Vietnamese men and women in the background are harvesting tea. So I was out there to interview the manager of the plantation. Now, the next 3 or 4 slides I'm going to show you are part 3 of my book. Part 1 is Saigon, part 2 is Pleiku, and part 3 is the war at home. Because as you may have guessed, I became disillusioned with the war while I was over there. And then in the mid to late 60s, I joined the peace movement, both as a reporter for a newspaper, writing about demonstrations and marches in New York and Washington, D.C., writing about it, and also as a participant. So this is the demonstration that took place, I think it was in 1967, in downtown Manhattan. And you can see the stock exchange on the right. So these are all, you look at these people, they're all wearing suits. Most of them are Wall Streeters. And we had marched down from further uptown in Manhattan. And this is in Central Park. There were so many demonstrations. I'm sure America was very, very divided during the Vietnam War, especially because we had a draft, and the draft was causing soldiers to be sent over there by the hundreds of thousands. This is a march in Washington, D.C., impudent snobs for peace. That was one of the sayings of the vice president then, referring to those of us whom he called beatniks or anti-war protesters. What was his name? I can't remember his name now, thankfully forgotten. And this is a demonstration in Central Park in which we lay on the ground like corpses and released white and black balloons. So those are all my pictures. And I could stop there, or I could read a short passage that kind of wraps up the story of my experience in Vietnam. So I want to ask you, Scott, how much time we have left.
Well, we're about 3 minutes from time, but honestly, we can extend longer and there's not a problem. So if you'd like to finish your presentation, that's fine.
Okay, well, I'll do that then. So to wrap up, I want to read one more short passage, and it concerns the last visit I had with one of my informants. And this is from my memoir. I also had a last tea get together with the deputy chief of province. We talked politely about the year I had there, and he queried me about when exactly I would be leaving. When I told him, he reflected a moment, and then he said he would now give me something to write in my final report. I was going to leave the next day. Now, he was a Buddhist, and as we all know, to advance your career in Vietnam in those days you had to be a Roman Catholic. He told me with candor about Vietnamese politics, the Buddhists, the Catholics, Americans, Viet Cong, and that he considered the situation to be hopeless. This is spring, April of 1963. He painted a gloomy scenario, but I recognized the truth in it. He expressed opinions that I was beginning to arrive at myself. His comments were sad, for sure, but in his openness, I felt a hopeful note. He ended our last meeting by saying, quote, "I tell you these things at last because you are leaving tomorrow. I feel like I am putting a note in a bottle and tossing it in the sea. Maybe someone will read it." He wished me luck. In this report I hand carried to Saigon, wondering in our own political military environment what would become of it. One thing I knew about the Army's bureaucracy: paperwork does get shuffled along. But to what use? I was reminded of Major Gallagher's comment when I first showed up in Saigon 12 months earlier. The military was committed to this thing, he had said. There was no going back, and we were not to question it. A few weeks after I came back, Thich Quang Duc, a leading Buddhist monk in Saigon, burned himself to death in Saigon. Malcolm Brown, an Associated Press reporter, was there, and his photograph of the incident won the Pulitzer Prize. When President Kennedy saw the picture, he reportedly told an associate, quote, "I knew then the war was lost." So thank you. And Scott, we can open it up to comments and questions.
Thank you so much, David. That's an amazing presentation, and appreciate everybody hanging in there with us, because I think you left everybody wanting much more. Your story is quite amazing. So I'm going to queue up some questions for you, but I'd like to talk to you about your photography for a minute, because these pictures are just stunning and amazing. And given that this was sort of the beginning of your career, how did you have the training or the sense of composition and all of that? Because these are just stunning images.
I had no training at all, and I didn't even have a light meter. That Saigon camera didn't have a light meter. But partway through my time in Pleiku, one of the missionaries I showed you a picture of, Charlie Long, got me in touch with a camera store in Hong Kong, and I sent away for a Canon 1 single lens reflex with a light meter. And so then I didn't lose as many pictures. But if you remember way back then, maybe still, when you bought a roll of black and white film, it came with a slip of paper that told you the exposures for full sun, partial sun, and shade. And that was my guideline. But to be truthful, if you're doing photographs where you have to take pictures very quickly, your eye becomes your light meter. And as long as the light conditions are relatively the same as they were in Vietnam for me, usually, I just use my eye. I didn't need a light meter. And I still, when I use a Leica now, I still very often operate that way, because it's clumsy and it takes time to get out your light meter and set it and then transfer it to the camera. Of course, now I also have a smart camera, and it's smarter than me, so I just set it on automatic and let it do all the thinking.
Well, let me start off by inviting Saul Grossman, if you want to unmute yourself and ask your question, Saul.
Yeah, why did the Montagnards ally with the South Vietnam and American forces?
Mostly it was coercion.
Oh, okay.
The South Vietnamese well, the Vietnamese in general do not have a good relationship with the Montagnards. The Vietnamese want their land. They want to expand their fields, their agriculture, into Montagnard country. So for many years, centuries probably, the Vietnamese and the Montagnards have had a bad relationship. The Vietnamese word for Montagnards is savages. And so when the French were in control during the French colonial period, if you were Vietnamese, you sort of had to have a passport. You had to have a certificate, even to get onto Montagnard country. The French were protective of the Montagnards. I think the Montagnards related us Americans to the French, and they liked us. I mean, they liked me for the most part right away. And I felt like I was with friendly people. But as I mentioned in my talk, ARVN, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, they would come into their villages and they would steal their food and they would harangue them about Ngo Dinh Diem and intimidate them, and then they would leave. And then at night, the Viet Cong would do the same thing. So, that was my impression of the relationship between the Montagnards and the foreigners, as it were. Now, I might say another thing is that the South Vietnamese were against the Americans giving the Montagnards guns because they feared a Montagnard rebellion. And in fact, there were rebellions. I mentioned the Jirai, I can't remember the tribe name right now, but down south around Bambi Tuit. One of the cases that I worked on had to do with an uprising of that tribe against the Vietnamese. And it happened a couple of years after I left. So that's the best I can do answering your question.
Since the reunification, have the Vietnamese gotten along better with the Montagnards, or?
I have not been back to Vietnam, but the little I've read is that the Vietnamese are still taking over Montagnard country, putting out a lot of pressure on them. Vietnam has changed so much since I was there 60 years ago that, it's better not to ask me what Vietnam is like now. I have not been back, and I haven't been able on the internet, at least, to inform myself well about the relationship between the Vietnamese and the Montagnards today.
Okay, thank you.
Our next question comes from Jerry Cole. Jerry, if you'd like to unmute yourself, you should be able to ask your question. There you go.
Hi.
You are on.
Hey, okay. Oh, first of all, the vice president you referenced was Spiro Agnew.
Right.
Right. So that was after 69 then. My question goes way back to the beginning. When they transfer you to Pleiku, I was surprised because you've been getting useful information from the Indian gentleman, Kumar. Did useful information stop coming, or did they just decide to transfer you anyway?
Well, a couple of things there. They transferred me anyway because it was in their plan to open a field office up north. And I was the only person that can do it because I spoke French. Nobody else spoke any known language up north. So that was one reason why. It occurred also, Colonel Kumar, his real name was Petrie. He was, his term ran out and he went back to India.
Right.
And then a third thing that I thought of afterwards is that those reports that the ICC wrote up for the United Nations about North Vietnamese military and South Vietnamese military forces and camps, they must have been on the record. And I don't doubt that high ups in the American government could have gotten access to those reports. I don't think they would have been secret. So I don't know about that, but I think that Colonel Gallagher, who told me that how important they were, he may not have figured out himself that the State Department could have gotten access to those reports.
Oh, I wondered about that. Yeah, I figured this. Yeah, somebody would know that information even
Yeah,
without.
who knows? I mean, they may be on the internet now.
Yeah.
Everything is.
All right. Thanks.
All right, next we have a name from my past too, Sheila Gummerman. Sheila, if you'd like to unmute yourself, be great to hear you again.
Hi, David. It's great to see you.
Hi, Sheila. Sheila and I are old friends.
Yeah, and this was amazing, and I loved your book. I just found it so fascinating because you were honest. You were so honest in your book. And when you talked in the beginning about primitive people, and a little bit disparaging at first, and then I found it fascinating the way your attitudes changed as you started interacting with various people in the tribes. But I especially liked, and I couldn't find this passage when I was looking for it this morning. You said it was written by an anthropologist who said that assessing superiority or inferiority of people is based on who has or had more or less things.
Yeah.
And I found that a really interesting passage. And I think an anthropologist mentioned that to you.
Yes,
Do you want to comment about that?
he was an anthropologist at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington that I went to visit. He was a friend of my sister's, and he asked me about the Montagnards, and when I told him they were primitive people, he held up his hand and said, "Wait a minute, what do you mean by that?" And now he helped me understand the connotation of the word primitive in terms of culture and intellectual capacity and civilization and so forth. He said that in cultures, people who are considered primitive are usually people who have less stuff. It doesn't mean that they think in any more inferior way than people who are civilized. So yeah, that was a good education for me.
I like that a lot that you included that. Thank you. And thank you for this whole session. It was really fun.
And by the way, since you mentioned that you're reading the book, it's available at Amazon and Noble and Barnes and Noble. And the publisher is McFarland and Company. And you can go to their site and order it direct from the publisher, and probably from bookstores too.
And I put a link for the Amazon and your website in the chat for everybody as well. And our next question is from Margaret Stevens, which ties in well with the last question. So Margaret, if you'd like to unmute yourself, you can ask your question.
Hello.
Oh, she can't unmute apparently. So I'll ask her question. She said, how did you transition from your time in Vietnam eventually to New Mexico and your work there as a writer, photographer, river guide, and student of Native Americans, their art and archaeology?
Yeah, that's a big question. You want my life story? To put it very briefly, being in Vietnam, especially in the Highlands, I got interested in ethnic people and in anthropology. I even signed up for an anthropology 101 class at the New School for Social Research in New York. And when I got out of the Army, I became friends with a photographer, a professional photographer. And I won't go into all of that, but he became kind of a spiritual mentor. And by happenstance, I found myself photographing Mohawk Indian steelworkers on a high building in Manhattan. Well, at the time that I started photographing them, they were at street level. And then later, as the building went up, like with the Montagnards, I took pictures of them and gave them to them after work. And these were Mohawk Indians from Canada, and they had feathers in their hard hats. So I knew they were from First Nation tribes. And I got to be friends with them, like I did with the Montagnards. And I went up to their reservations, kind of like I went up to the Central Highlands. And then I was drawn with my then girlfriend, now wife, who I think is on watching too, to photograph Native Americans all around the country on their reservations. And that led up north to the Great Lakes, to Montana. Then it got to be winter. We were living in a Volkswagen bus. It was very cold. We headed south. We got to Saigon. We found a house to rent. And I met Laura Gilpin, who some of you may know is a very outstanding, well-known Southwestern photographer, best known for photographing the Navajos. She gave me a tip one day for a job photographing on an archaeological site with the School for Advanced Research. So in that way, I got introduced to archaeology and to anthropologists and to Southwestern history and culture. And that was my journey into writing books and doing research on Southwestern topics, Native people and archaeology and the long cultural history of the American Southwest.
Thank you, Margaret, for that question. We had one question along the way. They can't unmute. They asked about the picture. I think you said it was the French tea plantation where there was a picture of a downed plane there, and they wanted to know the story of the plane, I guess.
That was a civilian plane. It was an American plane, but I think it was probably a CIA plane doing intelligence work that the engine failed or ran out of gas or something stupid, and it crash landed in this rice field just before I went out to that plantation to talk to the French manager or director. And he and I used to sit on his porch and on Sunday afternoons and drink gin and tonics, and he would tell me amazing stories about his life in Vietnam. And if you have a minute, I'll tell you one of them, which is also in the book. But one afternoon, some police from Pleiku went out to his plantation, and they told him that they wanted his fruit orchard. And he said, "What do you mean we want your fruit orchard?" He said, "Well, we want it and we'll pay you for it." And he was in a position where he had to pay off the South Vietnamese to raise tea, and he had to pay off the Viet Cong to raise tea. So when they demanded his fruit orchard, he said, okay, and they paid him. They sawed off his fruit trees at ground level, threw them in the back of trucks, drove away. That night, they went out to a strategic hamlet and dug post holes and stuck those fruit trees in the post holes. The next afternoon, the president, Nguyen Diem, came to Pleiku to inspect a strategic hamlet, and he drove by a fruit orchard full of fruit. So that's the level of misconception, or I should say deception, that was taking place at a military and political level in Vietnam.
I think we've got time for maybe one more question here. Norma Adams, you had a couple questions, but if you want to unmute yourself, you can ask one. There you go.
Hi there. I'm a friend of Norma Adams. Actually, my name is David. Liked your talk. You mentioned that at the beginning of your talk that you tried to get information through the Freedom of Information Act, and you said you kind of hit a brick wall and that was to no avail. Why was that?
Well, the first places, the National Archives and a couple of military installations that were connected with intelligence that I approached, told me that I'd gone to the wrong place. In the short of it, I went to 4 or 5 different places that were recommended to me as archives that had intelligence reports. And the last one is Fort Meade. And I was told, I sent them a Freedom of Information Act request. And a few days later, I got an answer, or around maybe a week or 2 later, a written answer saying that in order to respond to a Freedom of Information Act request like mine, they had to do it within a certain time period that was very short. They said the time period had run out and they didn't have any more time. And then I was told by someone at that fort that if indeed they found my reports, they would still be classified, secret, and that it would take a very long time, perhaps years, because of the backlog, to declassify them. Now, none of the stuff in my reports had any information that should be classified today, but this is bureaucracy and this is how the wheels turn. So I knew, I'd written the book, or I'd started to write it. I couldn't wait years for the possibility of these reports being found. I think they're in that archive somewhere, and that the military either don't have time or the will to look for them, or they can't find them. They're hard to find. I mean, papers are hard to find. They must have immense warehouse full of these kinds of documents, and maybe not the best cataloging system. My own personnel reports were all lost in a fire in the 1960s in St. Louis. So these things happen.
I had one more question. While listening to your talk, I couldn't help but think of a parallel between Vietnam and Afghanistan.
Oh, absolutely.
And, I started thinking about, one of my questions was in the chat was, do you see any parallels between the Viet Cong and the Taliban?
I do, because they were both well-funded. It was guerrilla warfare. When I was at Fort Holabird going into my training, or after my training, and I was waiting to get my shots and my passport and my visa, I had some time in my hands. I asked a senior officer there, senior intelligence officer, what I could do to learn about Vietnam and what I was going to be doing there. He said, Noble, if I were you, I would read up on Crazy Horse and Che Guevara. So these were both very successful guerrilla warriors. And I think that the Taliban and the Viet Cong were both well-funded guerrilla forces operating in South Vietnam, and also the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army, NVA. And so, I see so many parallels. I mean, the parallel between Vietnam and Iraq is another one. It's not so much the type of warfare, but it's the ignorance, the intelligence ignorance by the people who made the decisions. Now, Bush, I've read authoritatively, commissioned anthropologists to write reports about the situation in Iraq, and Bush's underlings put them right in the circular file. But the idea that the Iraqi people were waiting to become Democrats or become democratic form of government was something that these idiots in Washington believed, but was not, I'm sure, what was in these ethnographic reports that the government the State Department was receiving. So yeah, there are a lot of parallels. And one of the really tragic situations about the Vietnam War, other than the war itself, is how little those in power in the United States have learned, both in terms of foreign policy and in dealing with third world countries.
Well, David, that was an amazing presentation, and we appreciate everybody for coming out. And this has been recorded and will be shared as well. So if you want to share it out with friends or watch it again and all of that, we'll have that available. But just again, want to thank you so much for your presentation today, David, and we welcome you back anytime. And thanks to everybody for joining us.
And I thank you all, and I thank you for speaking out maybe an overlong talk.
That's okay. It was well worth it, and a little overtime won't hurt any of us, so that's okay. Well, David, thank you again. This is great to see you come around full circle and understand this bigger story, and we look forward to hopefully hosting you again someday.
Thank you.
All right, take care, everybody. Bye-bye.